He walked into the most powerful boardroom in Manhattan holding a mop. She laughed at him in front of 12 executives. Then he said 4 words that stopped a $3 billion deal cold and changed both their lives forever. She tried to humiliate him. What she got instead was the only warning that stood between her empire and total destruction. If you want to know what happened in that room, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like and comment the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The 42nd floor of Crowe Tower smelled like money and ambition, which in Manhattan were 2 different names for the same hunger. Vivian Crowe stepped off the private elevator at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before her first scheduled meeting, and 14 minutes before anyone else on her executive team would dare to arrive. That gap, those 14 minutes, was not accidental. It was architecture. She had designed her mornings the same way she designed everything, with precision, with intention, and with the understanding that the person who arrived last in any room had already surrendered an invisible advantage. Her heels struck the marble floor of the executive corridor in a rhythm that the building itself seemed to recognize. The cleaning staff, who were still finishing their overnight rounds, pressed themselves quietly to the walls as she passed their carts and buckets, retreating like ships, yielding the shipping lane to something larger and faster. She did not look at them. She never did. They were part of the infrastructure, like the ventilation system or the fire suppression panels, essential to the building's function, entirely beneath her attention. Vivian Crowe was 42 years old and had spent every single one of those years becoming the most dangerous person in whatever room she occupied. Not dangerous in the way that people who carried weapons were dangerous. Dangerous. The way a surgical instrument was dangerous, precise, cold, and capable of cutting through anything soft that got between it and its objective. She had inherited Crowe Industries at 31 when her father's heart gave out during a board meeting, and she had spent the next 11 years transforming his comfortable mid-tier corporate holding company into one of the most aggressive acquisition machines on the Eastern Seaboard. $3 billion in annual revenue. Offices in 7 cities. A board of directors who disagreed with her privately and voted with her publicly because they had learned each in their own painful way that disagreeing with Vivian Crowe publicly was the kind of mistake a person only made once. She was beautiful, the way expensive weapons were beautiful, with a kind of form that served function so completely that sentiment had no place in the equation. Charcoal Armani suit tailored to her exact measurements by a man in Milan who had been making her clothes for 9 years. Dark hair pulled back so severely that it looked less like a style choice and more like a statement about the relationship between softness and weakness. Steel gray eyes that processed people the way spreadsheets process data, quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. The boardroom on the 27th floor was already prepared when she arrived. The obsidian conference table reflected the city below like a mirror, 22 feet of polished black stone, surrounded by 12 leather chairs that cost more than most people in this city made in a month. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides turned the financial district into a backdrop. Manhattan arranged behind her like a stage set, designed to remind everyone who entered that they were in the presence of consequence. She pulled out the acquisition file for the last time before the meeting and read through it the way surgeons reviewed scans before opening a patient, looking not for new information, but for anything she might have missed. The Meridian Defense acquisition had taken 11 months to structure. 164 pages of due diligence, 3 independent valuations, 2 regulatory consultations, and enough legal work to fund a small law firm's Christmas bonus pool for a decade. The numbers were pristine. That was Marcus Webb's word for them, and Marcus did not use the word lightly. Meridian Defense Systems had 17 active military contracts with the federal government, a drone technology division that 2 of their primary competitors had already tried and failed to acquire, and a management team that had been quietly courted by defense contractors 3 times larger than Crowe Industries. On paper, it was not just a good deal. It was the kind of deal that got written about in business school case studies. By 9:30 that morning, Vivian expected to have unanimous board approval for a wire transfer that would make Crowe Industries a serious player in the defense sector. By Monday, she expected to have the keys to an empire she had been building toward for years. She closed the file, set it on the table, allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction, the way you might allow yourself 1 sip of wine before a meal, a preview of something larger to come. Then she straightened her jacket and waited for her executives to arrive. They came in order of seniority, which was the same as arriving in order of how much they feared her, the two hierarchies being functionally identical at Crowe Industries. Marcus Webb first at 6:58. 56 years old, Harvard, MBA. The kind of financial mind that could restructure a failing company's balance sheet in the time it took most people to finish their morning coffee. He wore a navy suit and a tie that probably cost $400, and he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had delivered nothing but good news for 3 consecutive fiscal years. "Morning, Vivian," he said, placing a leather portfolio on the table with the careful precision of someone setting down something valuable. "I reviewed the final valuation this morning. I want you to know I've been doing this for 28 years. This is one of the cleanest deals I've ever seen." "Good," she said. Daniel Mercer arrived at 7:03, which was 2 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, and which Vivian registered as a subtle erosion of the standard she expected. He was 38 Princeton Chief Operating Officer, and he moved through the world with the easy confidence of a man who had never yet lost anything he actually wanted. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way with dark eyes and a smile that belonged to someone who had always been welcomed in rooms like this, who had never had to earn the right to a seat at the table through anything harder than being exactly what a certain kind of room expected. "Vivian," he said, settling into his chair with the comfort of someone returning to a familiar throne, ready to make history. She looked at him for a moment without answering, which was its own kind of answer. The remaining executives filed in between 7:02 and 7:08. Legal strategy compliance operations. Each of them carrying the specific gravity of someone who understood that what was about to happen in this room would define the company for the next decade. The conversation as they settled was low-controlled, the particular murmur of people who were confident and trying not to show how confident they were in case it constituted tempting fate. At 7:09, Vivian called the meeting to order without preamble or pleasantry, because preamble and pleasantry were for people who were uncertain whether they deserved the room. "The Meridian Defense acquisition," she said, and the room went quiet, in the way that rooms went quiet when the person speaking owned everything inside them. Final thoughts before we move to authorize. Marcus Webb spoke first as protocol and hierarchy demanded. He ran through the valuation one final time, not because anyone needed to hear it, but because the ritual of speaking numbers aloud in a room like this was itself a form of commitment, a way of saying this is what we believe and we are willing to say so publicly. Meridian's drone division. The military contract timeline. The projected integration costs and the margin improvements that would follow. His voice carried the even cadence of a man who had made his peace with the decision and was now simply articulating what he already knew. Then Daniel. He spoke with the particular fluency of someone who understood that in rooms like this, delivery mattered as much as content. He talked about seamless integration, about management teams already aligned, about the future of the defense sector and Crowe Industries' place inside it. He steepled his fingers in front of him in a way that suggested not nervousness, but professorial confidence. He ended with, "We sign tomorrow, and by Monday, we own the future." There were nods around the table, not the performative nods of people going along with something, but the solid, unhurried nods of people who had already made their decision internally and were now simply expressing it. Vivian allowed herself the smallest smile. It was not joy. It was the expression of a person who had correctly predicted an outcome that mattered the particular satisfaction of finding the world exactly where you had expected it to be. Then the service door opened. Not the main door, the broad glass door through which executives entered with appropriate deference and properly scheduled timing. The service door, the one on the north wall that was supposed to function as invisible infrastructure, the door that cleaning staff and maintenance workers used precisely because it allowed them to exist in the background of important spaces without disturbing the foreground where the important things happened. A man backed through it pulling a yellow mop bucket on wheels. He was wearing a gray maintenance uniform that had been washed so many times the color had begun migrating towards something that was neither gray nor white, but occupied the exhausted territory between them. His back was to the room as he maneuvered the bucket through the doorway, and the small squeak of the wheels against the marble floor was the only sound in a room that had just gone completely still. He did not notice at first that every eye in the room was on him. He turned when he reached the corner near the coffee station, and for exactly 1 second, so brief that only Vivian caught it, something moved across his face. Not the panic she expected, not the embarrassed scramble of a person who had walked into the wrong room. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like the faintest trace of a recognition he had not expected and was choosing to suppress. He was in his early 30s or perhaps younger, and made older by something that calendars did not track. Lean with the leanness of people who forgot to eat, not from discipline but from mathematics, from the particular arithmetic of a budget that did not leave room for enough of anything. Dark hair that needed a cut by about 3 weeks. Brown eyes that should have been unremarkable and were not. His name tag read E. Cole, in letters that had been losing their color since sometime last winter. "Excuse me," Vivian said. Her voice was silk wrapped around a length of cold steel, and every person in the room heard both. "We're in a meeting." He looked at her directly, not with the rapid apologetic glance of someone hoping to minimize their intrusion, but with a steady, unhurried look that processed the room and understood what it was before he responded. "Sorry, Joe," he said. "I'll come back." He started to turn. "No." Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "You've already interrupted. Who sent you to facilities?" His voice was steady in a way she had not expected. Not the steadiness of indifference, but the steadiness of a person who had been through this particular gauntlet enough times to know exactly where the turns were. "There was a spill reported in this room. I was sent to take care of it." Vivian looked at the floor. The floor was pristine. The floor had been pristine when she arrived at 6:47 and had been pristine since because the only people in this room had been executives in tailored suits who did not spill things in boardrooms. "There is no spill," she said. "I can see that." A pause. "I'll let facilities know. Tell me something first." She walked around the head of the table slowly, and her footsteps marked the silence with that metronomic precision that her executives had long since learned to interpret as a sign that someone was about to have a very bad morning. Either facilities made a mistake or you're particularly bad at your job. Which is it? Two executives near the far end of the table produced small, careful sounds that might have been laughter. The kind of laughter that wasn't sure of itself yet, that was waiting to see whether it would be rewarded or punished for existing. The man Ethan Cole, though Vivian did not yet know his first name, looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "Probably both," he said. "I'm a temp. Started 3 days ago, still learning which floors are which." "A temp?" she repeated. She said the word the way forensic scientists might name a cause of death, factually without unnecessary drama, but with the weight of a conclusion. "Working here to make ends meet while you figure out your real passion, I assume. Artist? Musician? Aspiring something?" "No, ma'am." Daniel Mercer made a sound from his chair. "Ma'am," he repeated, amused. "Vivian, I think you frightened him into formal English." She ignored Daniel. She was standing directly in front of the man now, close enough to see the particular quality of the exhaustion in his face. It was not the tiredness of a bad night. It was deeper than that, structural, the kind that built up over months and years of not having enough. "What's your real job?" she said. "The one you tell yourself you're going to get back to." Something changed in his expression, barely visible. The exhaustion cracked along a fault line, and underneath it she caught a glimpse of something that had once burned very hot and had not entirely gone out. "This is my real job," he said quietly. "It pays $16.50 an hour, and it keeps the lights on for me and my daughter, so if there's nothing else I should probably go find the actual spill." He turned. "Wait." He stopped, did not turn around immediately, and in that brief pause Vivian registered something she rarely encountered. This was a man who was choosing to comply, not a man who was compelled to. There was a difference. Most people could not tell the difference. She always could. He turned back and looked at her. "Since you're already here," she said, and her voice had shifted into something almost conversational, almost pleasant the way a current looks calm on the surface in places where it runs deepest. "Let me ask you a hypothetical." "Vivian," Marcus started. She did not look at him. She was watching E. Cole with the focused attention she normally reserved for balance sheets and acquisition targets. I'm about to spend $3.2 billion acquiring a defense company, she said. Meridian Defense Systems. I have 12 experts in this room who have been working on this deal for almost a year. Every number lines up. Every projection looks clean. Every piece of due diligence has been reviewed and approved. She tilted her head slightly. Let's pretend, just for the sake of argument, that you were in my position. That kind of money, that size decision, everything on the line. What would you do? The room was completely quiet. 12 executives watched with the specific attention of people who were simultaneously entertained and deeply uncertain whether they should be. Ethan Cole looked at her for a long moment. She expected deflection. She expected the small, nervous laugh of someone who understood they were being used as an object lesson and was trying to exit the situation gracefully. She expected the stammering departure of a man who had no answer because the question was designed to remind him of everything he was not. What she got was none of those things. I'd walk away from it, he said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. This was not the silence of 12 people waiting to see what came next. This was the silence of 12 people who had heard something that did not fit the room they were in. Excuse me, Vivian said. From the deal. His voice did not change. Same even unhurried cadence. I wouldn't buy that company. Daniel Mercer laughed. Not a polite laugh or a surprise laugh. A full, genuine, thoroughly entertained laugh that filled the room and pressed against the windows. Perfect, he said. Vivian, you've found yourself an investment consultant. Tell me, is your expertise in Meridian Defense based on reading the journal while you mop? Or is there a specific school of cleaning supply finance I haven't encountered? More laughter, now less careful, spreading around the table like something released. Ethan Cole did not look at Daniel. He kept his eyes on Vivian. The drones are defective, he said. The laughter stopped. Not slowly. All at once, the way a light goes out. Vivian looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things that were not adding up with the particular focused quiet of a person whose intelligence had just been activated in a direction it had not been pointing a moment before. What did you say? She said. Meridian's drone technology division, he said. The one that's supposed to be the primary value driver of this acquisition. The performance data in their public filings doesn't match the test results that were reported to their own board in the internal documents from the third quarter of last year. A pause. The variance is significant enough that the military contracts you're counting on through 2030 are likely not renewable at their current terms. Possibly not renewable at all. Nobody moved. Ethan, Vivian said, using his name without knowing she had made the decision to do so, without knowing she had read it off the faded name tag without realizing it. How do you know what's in Meridian's internal documents? He looked at her steadily. Because I wrote the analysis that flagged them, he said. 3 years ago, when I was working for Harmon Capital as a senior quantitative analyst, before the market did what it did and I lost everything it was possible to lose and ended up here. The boardroom of Crowe Industries was 27 floors above Manhattan, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian Crowe felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Not literally, but something in the architecture of the morning had changed, and she understood with the instinct of someone who had been building things her entire life that the deal she had spent 11 months constructing had just developed a crack she had not put there. She looked at him. This man with his worn uniform and his yellow mop bucket. This temp who had started 3 days ago and was still learning which floors were which, and she said quietly, so only he could hear it, I want to see the analysis. He reached into the chest pocket of his uniform behind the name tag that read E. Cole and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out without drama or ceremony. She took it. She unfolded it. Read it again. And the empire she had spent 11 months building toward the future tilted on its foundation, while 12 of the most powerful executives in her industry watched her face and tried to understand what they were seeing. What they were seeing was Vivian Crowe reading a piece of paper that a janitor had just handed her, and realizing with the cold clarity of someone who built things for a living that everything in that room was about to change. Every number, every projection, every deal. and the man holding the mop had known it before he walked through the door. The paper was one-page handwritten on the back of what appeared to be a maintenance work order, the kind of form with checkboxes for tasks completed and a signature line at the bottom. Ethan had used the blank reverse side and filled it with numbers so dense and precisely arranged that they looked less like handwriting and more like something printed by a machine that understood grief. Vivian read it a second time, a third. Her face did not change because her face never changed when the situation required it not to. But behind her eyes, something was moving fast, cross-referencing what she was reading against 11 months of due diligence, against Marcus Webb's pristine numbers, against every projection and valuation and regulatory consultation that had led this room to this morning. The math was not complicated. That was the most unsettling part. It was not a sophisticated piece of financial engineering that required specialized knowledge to decode. It was a straightforward comparison of two sets of numbers that should have agreed with each other and did not a variance so clean and so deliberate that the moment you saw it, you understood it had not happened by accident. Meridian's public filings reported drone test performance at an average reliability rate of 91% across their primary product line. That was the number that appeared in every valuation, every projection, every slide deck that Marcus Webb had presented to this board across 11 months of acquisition planning. 91% reliability on a military-grade unmanned system was the difference between a defense contractor with a future and a defense contractor with lawyers. The internal board documents from Meridian's third quarter review the ones that Ethan Cole had written an analysis of 3 years ago when he was a different kind of man in a different kind of room reported actual test results of 63%. 28 points. The gap between what Meridian had told the world and what Meridian's own engineers had reported to their own directors was 28 percentage points, which, in the language of defense contracting, was not a discrepancy. It was a deception, and a deception of that magnitude in an industry where performance data was the foundation of every federal contract renewal meant that the military agreements Vivian had been counting on to anchor her return on investment through 2030 were sitting on ground that did not exist. She folded the paper, held it in both hands, looked at Ethan Cole. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not surprise exactly, more like a man recalculating a distance he had already walked in his mind. "I'm a janitor," he said. "You were a quantitative analyst at Harmon Capital 3 years ago." "Sit down, Mr. Cole." Something moved behind his eyes, a decision being made. He looked at the mop bucket and then back at her, and then he pulled out the chair nearest to him, the one that belonged to the Crowe Industries Director of Legal Affairs, who was currently sitting very still and watching this exchange with the expression of someone who could not decide if they were witnessing a firing or a hiring. Ethan sat. Vivian placed the paper on the table in front of Marcus Webb without ceremony. Marcus picked it up, and his face, normally the face of a man who had seen everything that corporate finance could produce and had stopped being surprised by any of it, went through 3 distinct expressions in approximately 4 seconds. "Where did this come from?" Marcus said, and his voice was different than it had been. The boardroom confidence had developed a hairline fracture. "Mr. Cole produced it," Vivian said. "Take your time." Marcus read. The room watched Marcus read. Daniel Mercer, who had laughed 14 seconds ago with the effortless amusement of a man who had never lost a deal he wanted, leaned forward in his chair, and the smile that had been living on his face since he walked through the door was no longer there. "This can't be right," Daniel said. "Why not?" Vivian asked. "Because we have independent valuations. We have audited financials. We have 3 separate consultants who reviewed Meridian's performance data and cleared it. If there was a 28-point variance in their reliability numbers, somebody would have caught it." "Mr. Cole caught it," Vivian said. 3 years ago." Daniel looked at Ethan with an expression that had left amusement far behind. "You're a janitor," he said. "You keep saying that," Ethan said quietly, "like it changes the math." The room went very still. Marcus set the paper down and took off his glasses and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose in the gesture of a man who was doing calculations that he did not want to arrive at their conclusion. "The internal board documents," Marcus said slowly.
If what's written here is accurate, Meridian's own directors knew about the reliability gap, which means when they presented performance data to us during the due diligence process, they were presenting numbers they knew were wrong. That's correct, Ethan said. That's fraud, said Catherine Hale, the director of legal affairs, speaking for the first time. She was 53, small in her chair, with the specific alertness of a lawyer who had just heard the word that changed every calculation in the room. Yes, Ethan said. You're certain? Vivian asked. He looked at her. The analysis I wrote 3 years ago was the reason Harmon Capital didn't pursue an acquisition of Meridian that was structured very similarly to this one. Different valuation, different terms, same fundamental flaw. Harmon walked away from that deal. The analyst who replaced me after the crash was not asked to pull historical files. A pause. Whoever ran your due diligence would not have found the internal documents unless they specifically requested Meridian's third-quarter board minutes from 2021. That's not a standard ask. It requires knowing what you're looking for. And you knew what you were looking for, Vivian said. I always know what I'm looking for, he said. And there was no arrogance in it. It was the same flat factual delivery he had used for everything else, which somehow made it more convincing than arrogance would have been. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the room, at 12 faces in various states of controlled alarm, at Marcus holding his glasses like a man who had temporarily lost his relationship with certainty, at Daniel Mercer, whose easy confidence had retreated somewhere inside him and left behind something that looked like the beginning of calculation. This meeting is suspended, she said. Marcus, I want a call with our primary due diligence firm in 1 hour. Catherine, I want the acquisition agreement reviewed for the indemnification clauses and any conditions that allow withdrawal. Nobody leaves this floor without speaking to me first. She picked up the folded paper from the table. And someone please get Mr. Cole a proper chair. What happened in the next 4 hours was not a meeting. It was a controlled demolition. Marcus Webb was on his phone before he reached the corridor, his voice dropping into the specific register of a man who was about to have a very difficult conversation with very expensive people. Catherine Hale had her associate on the line by the time she reached her office, reading sections of the acquisition agreement aloud in the practiced monotone of someone extracting structural information from a document under time pressure. The rest of the executive team dispersed across the floor in the particular pattern of a company that had just received news it needed to process before it could respond. Ethan Cole sat in the boardroom with a cup of coffee that someone had placed in front of him and that he had not yet touched, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the expression of a man who had stepped into a river he recognized. Vivian sat across from him. She had sent her assistant away. She had turned off her phone, which was something she did approximately 4 times a year, and only when she needed to think without interruption. The boardroom that had been full of consequence and performance an hour ago was now just a room with a very large table and 2 people who were deciding what to do with what they knew. Tell me about Harmon Capital, she said. He looked at the coffee, looked at the city, looked at her. What do you want to know? Start with what you did there. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people were quiet when they were deciding how much of something to give, not because he was calculating an advantage, but because the territory she was asking him to walk back into was one he had spent 3 years carefully not visiting. I ran quantitative risk analysis for acquisitions, he said, primarily in the defense and aerospace sectors. My job was to find the things that the standard due diligence process was not designed to look for. Not fraud necessarily, although that was part of it. More specifically, the structural vulnerabilities that looked like assets until you applied stress to them. Things that worked in favorable conditions and failed in the conditions that actually mattered. Like 63% reliability on a military drone platform, Vivian said. Among others. He picked up the coffee, set it down again without drinking it. I was good at it. I don't say that to impress you. I say it because it's the relevant fact. I was good at it because the patterns that other analysts missed were not to me hidden. They were visible. I just had to look at the numbers from the right angle. What happened? He looked at the window. The city was doing what the city always did, moving at the speed of its own hunger, indifferent to any specific human drama taking place inside its towers. The market happened, he said. 2022. The particular version of it that hit the quantitative funds hardest. Harmon Capital lost 38% of its value in 11 months. They restructured, eliminated entire departments. My division was cut in the second round, which was fast, which told me how the leadership had decided to categorize the risk analysis function. A pause. Expendable. And after, my wife had been sick for 2 years before that. Treatment costs had already taken most of what we had saved. After the job, the medical bills that we had been managing on my income became the kind of problem that doesn't have a comfortable solution. He stopped, started again. She passed away 14 months ago. My daughter is 7. After the funeral costs and the remaining medical debt, I had enough to keep us in our apartment for approximately 4 months. After that, I took whatever work I could find. Vivian listened. She did not offer sympathy because the situation was not asking for sympathy. The situation was asking to be understood, and she was very good at understanding things. "You've been doing maintenance work for how long?" she said. 8 months. 3 different temp agencies. I follow the buildings with the most floors because the hourly rate is slightly better. Something that might have been the ghost of something wry moved across his face. "This is my 2nd week at Crowe Tower. And you walked into a meeting this morning because facilities told you there was a spill." "There was supposed to be a spill." He looked at his hands. "I've been on this floor 3 times this week. I overheard enough, not intentionally, I want to be clear about that. I overheard enough to understand what was being decided in that room. And I knew what I knew about Meridian. I didn't walk in there to say anything. I genuinely thought I was there to clean a spill. But when I gave you the opening, you took it." He met her eyes. "You asked me what I would do. You were using me as a prop. In a lesson, you were teaching your board about the distance between your kind of thinking and everyone else's." His voice was not accusatory. It was exact. "I decided that the correct answer to that particular question was not the answer you were expecting." Vivian looked at him for a long time. In 20 years of building and running Crowe Industries, she had encountered approximately 9 people whose intelligence she found genuinely surprising. Not impressive, not competent, not technically skilled. Surprising. People whose minds worked in a way that produced results she had not predicted, which was the rarest thing she knew. She was looking at one now, and the particular irritation of that recognition was something she was going to have to decide what to do with. "The wire transfer was scheduled for 9 tomorrow morning," she said. "I know. I heard Marcus Webb mention it in the corridor on Tuesday. If you hadn't walked in this morning, we would have sent $3.2 billion to a company whose primary asset is performing at 63% of what they represented." "Yes." "And the federal contracts would have come up for renewal, and the performance data would have been subject to government audit, and the gap between what Meridian reported and what their systems actually delivered would have been discovered. Within 18 months, he said. Possibly sooner if there were field performance issues. Military operators report anomalies on a different timeline than commercial users, which would have exposed Crowe Industries to the fraud because we would have been the acquiring party. Contingent liability of that nature is difficult to fully insulate against," he said. "Depending on what your legal team found in the indemnification clauses, you might have had partial protection. But the reputational damage in the defense sector from being associated with a procurement fraud of that scale would have been, in my assessment, more costly than the financial exposure." Vivian stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking at Manhattan the way she looked at all problems, searching for the angle from which the structure was most visible. "Where is your daughter right now?" she said. The question surprised him. She heard it in the small pause before he answered. "At school, PS 187. She gets out at 3:15. "You take the subway?" "Yes." "Which line?" "The A from Columbus Circle." She turned around. "I have a proposal for you, and I want you to understand that it comes with no obligation and no pressure. And if you decline it, I will personally ensure that Facilities cuts you a check for today's full shift, regardless of hours worked, because you have saved this company from a very expensive mistake, and that has value regardless of what you decide." He looked at her steadily. "What's the proposal?" "I want you to review the Meridian due diligence file, the complete file, 164 pages plus supporting documentation. I want to know what else is in there that my people missed." "That would take time I don't have," he said. I have a shift tonight at a building on 6th Avenue that I can't miss because the temp agency has a 3-strike absence policy, and I'm at 2. Vivian picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "This is Vivian Crowe," she said when the line connected. "I need a direct number for the executive office." A pause. "Thank you." She waited. "This is Vivian Crowe. I'm calling to clear a schedule conflict for one of your temporary staff, Ethan Cole. His assignment tonight needs to be covered by another contractor. I'll compensate the agency for the inconvenience at double the standard rate for the shift." Another pause. "That's correct. Vivian Crowe. Crowe, Crowe Industries. You can verify the call through our corporate switchboard if you'd like." A final pause. "Thank you." She hung up. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she could not place because she had not seen it directed at her before. Not gratitude, not the particular relief of a person who has just been rescued. Something more complicated, something that involved both appreciation and a wariness that told her he had learned to be careful with things that looked like help. "My daughter," he said. 3:15. "My driver will pick her up and bring her here. She can wait in the reception area on 32 where there is a couch and a television and someone at the desk who is very good with children. You will see her before 6 o'clock. He was quiet for a moment. "Her name is Mia," he said finally. "She's 7. She has a backpack shaped like a dinosaur, and she will tell whoever picks her up that her father said it was okay because she tells everyone that and it's usually not true. So the driver will need to know the code phrase she uses with her teacher for authorized pickups." "What's the code phrase?" "Blue sky," he said. "Her mother's idea." Something moved through his face and settled. She said it was the kind of phrase that was hard to forget when you needed it. "Blue sky," Vivian repeated. She sent a text to her driver with the school address, the child's name, and the phrase, and then she set her phone face down on the table and looked at Ethan Cole. "The file is in the conference room on 26, she said. "I'll have it brought up. I'll need access to Meridian's SEC filings from 2019 through 2023, he said, "and if you have any contact reports from the due diligence team's site, visit to Meridian's Virginia facility. I want to see those specifically." "You'll have everything we have." He stood up, and for just a moment the exhaustion in his face was replaced by something else, the same thing she had glimpsed underneath it in the brief seconds before he had suppressed it. Not pride exactly, but purpose. The specific alertness of a mind that had been doing work far beneath its capacity and had just been handed something that required all of it. He looked at the mop bucket still sitting in the corner where he had left it. "I'll have someone return that to facilities," Vivian said. "It's not mine," he said. "It belongs to the building." He followed her out of the boardroom and down the corridor toward the elevator that would take them to 26, and as he walked, he did not look like a man who had spent 8 months pushing cleaning carts through the buildings of people who did not look at him. He looked like a man who was walking towards something he recognized moving at the speed of someone who understood the terrain. The file was waiting for him when they arrived. 164 pages, organized by category in a set of binders that represented 11 months of collective expertise from people whose combined professional credentials would fill a very long wall. He sat down at the table and opened the first binder and began reading, and within 3 minutes the quality of his silence had changed in a way that Vivian noticed but could not precisely describe. He was not reading. He was searching. There was a difference in the way his eyes moved across the page in the occasional small stillness, when he found something that connected to something else, in the way his right hand moved periodically to make a note in the margin with the pen he had produced from the chest pocket of his maintenance uniform. Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work, and she thought about the specific nature of waste, not the financial kind, not the kind she dealt with in spreadsheets and write-downs and depreciation schedules, the human kind. The kind that happened when a mind capable of something real was redirected by circumstance into tasks designed for something different. She thought about how many people in the buildings she owned were pushing mop buckets down corridors when they should have been sitting at tables like this one, and she thought about how she had never once considered that question before this morning. Then she went back to her floor to begin the process of unwinding a deal that should never have been built and left Ethan Cole alone in a room with 164 pages and a pen and a mind that had been waiting 3 years for something worth finding. By 2 in the afternoon, he had flagged 11 additional discrepancies. By 3, he had built a case that Marcus Webb, reviewing it over his shoulder with the expression of a man watching his own certainty disassemble itself piece by piece, described as the most comprehensive fraud analysis he had seen in 28 years in corporate finance. At 3:40, a 7-year-old girl with a dinosaur backpack arrived on the 32nd floor and sat on the couch in the reception area and immediately told the woman at the desk that her father had said it was okay, and the woman smiled and said she knew, and brought her a glass of apple juice and turned on the television to a channel that showed animated animals solving problems through teamwork. And on the 26th floor, Ethan Cole turned to the final page of the Meridian file, wrote one last note in the margin, and looked up at the window where the afternoon light was coming through at the angle that meant it was later than he had planned. "There's one more thing," he said to no one in particular because Marcus had stepped out to take a call, and Vivian had not yet returned from her meeting with legal. He said it the way a person says something they know is going to change the room they are standing in quietly without drama, with the specific gravity of someone who has just found the last piece of something and understands exactly what the complete picture means. He picked up his pen and wrote a name at the bottom of his final page of notes. The name was Daniel Mercer. The name sat at the bottom of the page in Ethan's careful, unhurried handwriting, and for a moment he simply looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been moving toward without knowing it, the destination that only becomes recognizable once you have arrived. Daniel Mercer. He had not written it as an accusation. He had written it the way he wrote everything, as the conclusion of a sequence, the last number in a calculation that had been building across 11 pages of notes and 164 pages of documents. The name was there because the documents put it there. Because when you followed the trail of what was missing from the Meridian due diligence file, when you mapped the specific gaps against the timeline of the acquisition process, when you cross-referenced which reviews had been assigned to which members of the executive team, and then compared those assignments against what the reviews had, and had not examined, a pattern emerged that was not ambiguous. The site visit report from Meridian's Virginia facility was the clearest example. It had been conducted 6 months ago by a team of 3, led by Daniel Mercer personally. Standard protocol for an acquisition of this scale required that site visits include a review of the target company's internal quality control documentation, specifically the performance testing records that fed into their reported reliability metrics. The site visit report in the file was 42 pages long, detailed on every subject except one. There was no section on quality control documentation. There was a line that said QC records, reviewed satisfactory with no supporting analysis, no comparison to reported metrics, no documentation of what had actually been examined. 42 pages and one sentence where there should have been 15 pages of comparative analysis. Ethan had seen this kind of gap before. Not often, but enough to know the difference between an oversight and a decision. An oversight left traces the half-finished section, the note that said to return to this later, the evidence of a process that had started and been interrupted. A decision left nothing. A decision left exactly what was here, a single line designed to close a door without drawing attention to the fact that anything had been behind it. He was still looking at the name when Vivian walked back into the room. She moved the way she always moved, with the forward-leaning purpose of someone whose default relationship with space was to own it. But when she came through the door and looked at his face, she stopped. Not a dramatic stop. A recalibration, the kind that happened when a person who read rooms for a living walked into one that was telling her something she had not expected. "What did you find?" she said. He turned the page around and pushed it across the table toward her. She looked at the 11 flag discrepancies, first scanning each one with the rapid comprehension of someone who understood financial documents at the structural level. Her face went through a series of small, controlled adjustments as she read the kind of micro-expressions that most people would have missed, but that collectively told the story of a person receiving information that was confirming something she had been hoping not to confirm. Then she reached the bottom of the page. She was still for a moment, not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a person who was deciding how to receive something before they allowed themselves to react to it. "You're telling me Daniel knew," she said. I'm telling you the site visit report he filed has a structural gap that is not consistent with the standard it was supposed to meet, Ethan said carefully. I'm telling you the gap occurs specifically in the section that would have revealed the reliability discrepancy. I'm telling you that the gap is too clean to be accidental. He paused. What you do with that information is your decision. How long have you been sitting with this? About 40 minutes. She looked at the name again. Daniel Mercer, 38 years old. Princeton, Chief Operating Officer of Crowe Industries for 4 years. A man with a smile that belonged to someone who had never lost anything he actually wanted. She thought about that phrase now, and it took on a different character entirely because there were two kinds of people who never lost what they wanted. People who were exceptionally capable, and people who were willing to do things that capable people were not. What was his relationship with Meridian, she asked, outside of the acquisition process? That's beyond what's in this file, Ethan said. I can tell you what the documents show. I can't tell you what the documents don't have. I know. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, and for the first time since the morning, she looked like someone who was carrying weight rather than someone who was directing it. Marcus is going to need to see this. Yes. And legal. Absolutely. And then we're going to need to make some decisions very quickly about how we handle this before Daniel realizes that the acquisition is being reconsidered and starts connecting the reasons why. Ethan looked at her. How much time do you have before he expects to hear something from you? I told the team the meeting was suspended for review. That buys me until end of business today, without it looking like anything other than standard caution. She glanced at her watch. It's 4:12. Then you have about 2 hours. Yes. She picked up her phone and sent a single text. Marcus. Conference room 26. Now. Bring Catherine. She set the phone down and looked at Ethan across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was not uncomfortable, but it was full the way rooms were full when something that could not be undone had just been set in motion. I owe you an apology, she said. He looked at her. For what? This morning, the boardroom. A pause. What I did with you in front of my executives was not appropriate. You were doing a job and I used you as an instrument for something else. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't know what I knew. That doesn't change what I did. No, he agreed. But it changes the context. He looked at the window. The afternoon light had shifted to the particular amber of 4 o'clock in October, the kind of light that made Manhattan look briefly like a painting of itself. In my experience, people who apologize for things they didn't have to apologize for are rarer than people who don't apologize for things they absolutely should. So I'll take it. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Vivian's face. It was different from the expression she had worn in the boardroom that morning. Less sharp. More like something genuine finding its way to the surface of a face that had spent years keeping that particular distance. Marcus Webb and Catherine Hale arrived within 4 minutes of each other, which told Ethan that they had both been close, both waiting for the next development, with the particular readiness of people who understood that today was not finished yet. Marcus sat down, looked at the notes, looked at Ethan, looked at Vivian with an expression that said he needed the sequence explained before he could respond to it. Vivian explained it. She did it in the direct, structured way she did everything without editorializing and without softening, which Ethan observed and found himself respecting, because it would have been easy to soften, easy to frame Daniel Mercer's name as a question rather than a conclusion, and she didn't. The silence after she finished had a specific texture. Daniel, Marcus said finally. He said it the way you said a name when you were trying to reconcile it with something that felt impossible, holding it at a slight distance to see if it would resolve into something recognizable. The documentation supports it, Vivian said. Ethan. Ethan walked Marcus through the site visit report gap page by page with the patient precision of someone who had explained complex things to skeptical audiences before and understood that the path to conviction was not assertion but demonstration. He showed Marcus where the analysis should have been. He showed Marcus what the absence of that analysis had allowed the acquisition team to miss. He showed Marcus the specific language of the single covering sentence that had been used to close the gap, And then he showed Marcus 3 other site visit reports from the same acquisition process conducted by different team members, and showed him what a complete quality control review actually looked like in documentation. Marcus did not interrupt. He read what Ethan pointed to. He looked at the comparisons. And the expression on his face moved through skepticism into something heavier and more settled, the expression of a man who was completing a calculation he had not wanted to begin.
"What's his motive?" Marcus asked. Not arguing, asking. "That's the question we need to answer before end of business," Vivian said. "It has to be financial," Catherine said. She was leaning forward slightly, her hands flat on the table, her legal mind already moving ahead into the territory of what this meant and what it required. A deal this size, a gap, this specific, this deliberate. Someone offered him something to make sure this acquisition went through. "Meridian," Marcus said. "Or someone with a stake in Meridian," Catherine said. "A shareholder who stood to gain from the sale at this valuation. A third party who needed Crowe Industries to absorb the liability before the performance data became publicly contested." She looked at Vivian. "We need his financials, personal accounts the last 24 months at minimum." "We don't have the authority to pull his personal financial records," Vivian said. "No," Catherine agreed. "But the SEC does. And if we bring them a fraud case with this level of documentation, they will." "That's a significant step," Marcus said. "So is signing a $3.2 billion wire transfer based on a fraudulent due diligence review," Catherine said. The room was quiet again. Ethan had stopped speaking. He had said what the documents said, and now the documents were going to do their work through people with the authority to act on them, which was the natural end of his role in this particular sequence. He was aware that he was sitting in a room where decisions were being made that would affect thousands of people and hundreds of millions of dollars, and the careers and freedom of at least one man who had walked into a boardroom that morning wearing the confidence of someone who had already won. He was also aware that it was 4:38, and Mia had been in the reception area on 32 for nearly an hour. "Excuse me," he said. He said it quietly and without apology, which was the only way he knew how to say things anymore. "My daughter." Vivian looked at him. Then she looked at Marcus and Catherine with the expression of someone who was delegating the next phase of a process to people she trusted to handle it. "Marcus, I need you to reach out to our contact at the SEC field office. Use the private line, not the corporate switchboard. Catherine, I need a full privilege review on the acquisition file and a memo outlining the potential liability exposure if we proceed versus if we withdraw and report. I want both of those on my desk by 7. She stood. "I'll be on my phone." She walked to the door, then stopped and looked back at Ethan. "I'll walk you down." They rode the elevator in silence for the first few floors. Then Vivian said without looking at him, "This morning I told myself I was going to sign that wire transfer tomorrow and change the shape of this company permanently." "You still might," Ethan said. "Just not in the direction you planned." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Not in the direction I planned." The elevator opened on 32, and Ethan heard his daughter before he saw her, a sound that was somewhere between a declaration and a question delivered in the particular frequency that 7-year-olds used when they had been patient for a long time, and had decided that patience had served its purpose. "Daddy, the lady said you were working very important and I should wait, and I waited, but the show ended and there's nothing else on and I'm hungry." She was standing at the edge of the reception area with her dinosaur backpack hanging off one shoulder, wearing the expression of someone who had fulfilled their obligations and was now ready to renegotiate the terms. She was small for her age, with dark hair and brown eyes that were her father's, and a chin that had a different quality to it, a set that Ethan recognized as coming from somewhere else. He crouched down to her level. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry. We're going now." "Did you finish working for today?" Mia looked past him at Vivian, the way children looked at adults they had not been introduced to, with the frank, uncalculated assessment of someone who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. "Are you my daddy's boss?" she asked Vivian. Vivian looked at the child with an expression that did not belong to the boardroom, something less armored and more human that existed apparently underneath the Armani and the sharpened cheekbones and the steel gray eyes. "Something like that," she said.
He's good at his job, Mia said with the decisive confidence of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion. I'm beginning to understand that, Vivian said. He used to work in a big office before. Then things got hard, but he always says hard things don't last forever. She considered this with the gravity of someone repeating wisdom they had not yet fully tested against the world. He says the numbers always tell the truth if you know how to read them. Vivian looked at Ethan over the top of his daughter's head. He met her eyes and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said with considerably more precision than he could have managed. That's very true, Vivian said to Mia. Your father is right about that. They left through the lobby, and Ethan held Mia's hand, and the evening city received them the way it received everyone, without ceremony, without recognition, moving at the speed of its own enormous appetite. Mia talked about the animated animals she had watched on the television and about a disagreement she had arbitrated at recess that day, involving a disputed rule in a game whose mechanics she explained in more detail than the situation strictly required. And Ethan listened and responded in the appropriate places, and the weight of the day moved through him in the particular way that weight moved when you had been carrying it for a long time and were still not sure you could put it down. What he did not tell Mia because she was 7 and the world she needed to believe in was not yet ready for this particular detail was that sitting in that conference room on the 26th floor with the Meridian file, he had felt something return to him that he had quietly accepted was gone. Not the career, not the income or the status or the specific professional identity that the crash and everything after had taken, something more essential than any of those things. He had felt like himself again. The self that saw the patterns that read the numbers from the right angle that found the truth in documents designed to hide it. The self that had been doing this work for 8 months in maintenance uniforms and had been completely invisible to the people whose buildings he moved through, not because he had nothing to offer, but because the structures that decided what a person was worth had looked at his job title and made a calculation that had nothing to do with the actual value of what was inside him. He did not know what tomorrow looked like. He did not know what Vivian Crowe was going to do with everything he had handed her today, whether she would use it and move forward or find a way to manage it quietly in the manner of powerful people who preferred to protect their institutions over exposing their own errors. He did not know whether Daniel Mercer would sense the shift in the next 2 hours and do something that made the situation more complicated. He did not know whether the SEC contact Marcus was calling would move at the speed the situation required or at the speed that regulatory bodies typically moved, which was a different speed entirely. What he knew was that a $3.2 billion fraud had been stopped this morning by a piece of paper he had been carrying in his chest pocket for a week, waiting for a moment that had looked until it arrived like a humiliation. They reached the subway entrance at Columbus Circle, and Mia wanted to count the steps going down, which she did every time, which had been her mother's idea, which was one of the many small inherited rituals that Ethan maintained with a faithfulness that was not about sentiment, but about the specific way continuity held a person together. 1, Mia said, stepping down. 2, 3. He counted with her, his hand in hers, the city above them doing what the city always did. At that exact moment, 27 floors above the street in the conference room that had started the day as the site of a coronation and had ended it as something else entirely. Daniel Mercer stood at the window looking at the same city with the expression of a man who had just realized that a calculation he had been relying on was no longer adding up. His phone showed 3 missed calls from a number he recognized as belonging to a man at Meridian Defense who was not supposed to call him on this number. He had not returned them. He was not going to return them from this building. What he was going to do was think quickly, carefully, and with the specific focus of a man who had been in difficult positions before and had always found the exit that other people missed. He straightened his jacket, composed his face into the relaxed, unhurried expression that had served him in every room he had ever needed it, and he walked back down the corridor toward Vivian's office to ask with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to hide how the review was going and whether there was anything he could do to help move the process along. He did not know that the file he had spent 6 months carefully editing was already in the hands of someone who read numbers from the right angle. He did not know that his name was written at the bottom of a page on the 26th floor in handwriting that was careful and exact. He did not know
That the janitor who had walked out of the building 40 minutes ago with a 7-year-old girl in a dinosaur backpack had already done the only thing that needed to be done. The door to Vivian's office was closed when he reached it, which was unusual. Her assistant, a composed woman named Sandra, who had worked for Vivian for 6 years and who gave nothing away in her expression as a matter of professional principle, looked up at him with a pleasantness that was completely impenetrable. "She's on a call," Sandra said. "I'll let her know you stopped by." "Of course," Daniel said with the smile that had never failed him. "No rush." He walked back to his own office, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, in the silence of a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath a structure he had been standing on very confidently was no longer making the sounds it was supposed to make. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began very quietly to think about what he knew and what other people knew, and how much time he had before those two things occupied the same room. The answer to the last question was less than he thought. 3 floors below him, Catherine Hale was on the phone with a former colleague at the federal prosecutor's office, speaking in the careful, precise language of a lawyer who was not yet filing anything, but was making sure the architecture of a future filing was sound before a single brick was laid. And in Marcus Webb's office, a phone rang twice, and was answered on the third by a man at the SEC field office in Lower Manhattan who had worked with Marcus twice before on matters that required discretion and speed, and who understood from the first 20 words of the conversation that this was the kind of call that did not wait until morning. The call between Marcus Webb and the SEC field office lasted 19 minutes, which was 17 minutes longer than most preliminary contacts of that nature. And when Marcus hung up, his hand stayed on the receiver for a moment, in the way hands stayed on things when the weight of a conversation had not yet fully transferred from the air into the body. He sat in his office with the door closed and the city doing its indifferent evening work outside his window. And he thought about Daniel Mercer, whom he had known for 4 years, whom he had sat beside in 200 meetings and shared airport terminals with on 6 continents, and whose professional judgment he had defended twice to Vivian when she had expressed in her precise and economical way that she was not entirely certain Daniel's ambitions and the company's interests were always moving in the same direction. He had told her she was wrong both times. He thought about that now with the specific quality of regret that belonged to people who prided themselves on reading situations accurately. Then he picked up the phone and called Vivian. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for it. "He's ready to move," Marcus said, "but he needs something from us first, a formal written summary of what we found signed with the supporting documentation attached. He wants it in his hands before he opens an inquiry because he needs the predicate to be clean, his words." "How long to prepare that?" Vivian said. "Catherine says 2 hours if we start now." "Then we start now." "Vivian," he paused. "Daniel came by your office an hour ago. Sandra told him you were on a call." A silence. "I know. He's going to figure out that something has shifted. He's not a careless man." "No?" Vivian agreed. "He's not." Another pause. "Which is exactly why we have 2 hours and not 4. Marcus, get Catherine and meet me on 26. And Marcus, do not speak to Daniel between now and when this is done. If he finds you, you're working on a valuation review. Nothing more." "Understood." The call ended and Marcus stood up and put his jacket back on with the careful deliberateness of someone preparing for something that required being properly dressed, which was perhaps not rational, but was the kind of ritual that carried a person through the moments when rational was not enough. On the 26th floor, Vivian was already at the conference table with the Meridian file open in front of her, and Ethan's 11 pages of notes arranged in sequence beside it. She had not called Ethan back. She had considered it and decided against it, not because his work was not needed, but because what needed to happen now was the institutional response to what he had found, and that response belonged to the people with the authority to deliver it. He had done his part. The machine that turned private knowledge into public consequence needed to run on its own tracks from here. She was halfway through building the summary document when her office phone rang with the internal extension that meant someone on the executive floor was calling her direct line, bypassing Sandra, which required a code that only 4 people in the building had. One of those people was Daniel Mercer. She looked at the phone for 2 rings, 3.
Then she picked up. Vivian. His voice was exactly as it always was, warm, unhurried, carrying the low register of a man who had never needed to perform urgency because urgency implied that something was outside his control. I know you're in the middle of something. I just wanted to check in. I heard Marcus is still here and Catherine. I assume the acquisition review is more involved than we expected. It is, she said. Anything I can help with, I led the site visit. If there are questions about the Virginia facility documentation, I'm the right person to walk anyone through it. She noted the offer. She noted specifically that it was the site visit documentation he had offered, which was the thing most likely to be under review, and which he would want to be present for when it was examined. I appreciate that, she said. I think we have what we need for tonight. We'll reconvene in the morning. A pause, barely perceptible. The pause of a man measuring a distance. Of course, he said. Whatever you need, I'll be in early. Good night, Daniel. She hung up and looked at the phone for a moment and thought about the fact that he had called her on the private line rather than coming to the floor, which meant he was being careful, which meant he already knew that careful was required, which meant the 2 hours Marcus had estimated was probably optimistic. She typed faster. Marcus and Catherine arrived within minutes of each other, and the three of them worked in the particular focused silence of people who understood that the document they were building had to be airtight before it left the building. That the first formal submission to a federal regulator in a case like this was the foundation. Everything else would be built on, and a foundation with cracks would cost them in ways that the original fraud might not. Catherine drafted the legal framework. Marcus verified every numerical reference against the source documents, cross-checking Ethan's notes against the original filings with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 28 years making sure that when he signed his name to a number, the number was right. Vivian wrote the narrative, the chronological account of what the due diligence process had been, what it should have found, what it had failed to find, and the documented evidence of why that failure was not accidental. At 8:47, Catherine printed the final document, 63 pages plus supporting materials. She read through it one more time with the pen in her hand, making 3 small corrections, and then she looked up at Vivian and said, "It's clean." "Send it," Vivian said. Catherine sent it to the secure email address the SEC contact had provided to Marcus, with a follow-up call to confirm receipt and a brief conversation in which the man on the other end said, in the measured tone of someone who had seen significant things and had learned not to signal surprise, that he would review it tonight. Tonight, he had said. Not this week. Not when the review queue allowed. Tonight. Marcus looked at Vivian after Catherine ended the call and said, "What do we do about Daniel?" Vivian closed the Meridian file for the last time. "Nothing tonight," she said. "We let the process run. If we move on him before the SEC has opened a formal inquiry, we create a situation where he can argue that the company acted to protect itself at his expense. We need the external process to be in motion first. And tomorrow morning when he walks in expecting a normal day?" "Tomorrow morning will not be a normal day," she said, "but it will look like one until it doesn't." She drove home at 9:30 through the lit corridors of Manhattan, and the city outside the car window looked the same as it always did, but felt different in the way that familiar things felt different after the day had fundamentally rearranged your understanding of who occupied the spaces around you. She thought about Daniel, about 4 years of working beside him, about the Princeton confidence and the easy smile and the way he had laughed in the boardroom that morning, that full genuine laugh at a janitor who had turned out to know more about the deal than anyone in the room. She thought about what it meant to be wrong about a person. Not just professionally wrong, not just the financial and legal exposure of having trusted someone who had been operating against her interests. She was a person who had built her life on the ability to read situations accurately, to see what was actually there, rather than what people wanted her to see. Being wrong about Daniel was not just a security failure. It was a failure of the instrument she trusted most. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she did not recognize. It said, "You should check the parking garage camera feed from tonight, level B2, 9:05 p.m. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she called building security. The footage showed Daniel Mercer in the parking garage at 9:05, standing beside a dark sedan that did not belong to any Crowe Industries employee. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. The man he was speaking to was partially obscured by the angle of the camera, but not entirely. He was heavy-set in his 50s, wearing a dark coat, and at one point he turned enough that the camera caught a clear profile. Vivian had never seen him before. But Catherine, who Vivian called immediately after viewing the footage, made a sound on the other end of the line that told a different story. "That's Richard Holt," Catherine said. Her voice had gone very still. "He's on Meridian's board of directors. I saw him at their presentation during the second round of due diligence. He sat in the back and didn't ask any questions." The silence between them had the specific weight of something becoming larger than it had been. "Forward everything to the SEC contact," Vivian said. "Tonight." "Vivian, if Holt is involved, this isn't just a due diligence gap. This is a coordinated fraud operation. The scale of that is." "I know what the scale of that is," Vivian said. "Send it." She did not sleep well. Not because she was afraid, because fear was not the primary emotion of the night, but because the thing she had been building for 20 years had come within one morning of being used as a vehicle for something she had not chosen and would not have chosen, and the proximity of that was not a thing she could simply process and file and move forward from in one night. She was at her desk at 6:15 an hour before anyone else in the same position she occupied every morning, but sitting in it differently than she had the day before. At 7:02, Daniel Mercer walked off the elevator with a coffee in his hand and the expression of a man who had prepared very carefully for the performance of a normal morning. He was dressed impeccably. He moved with the easy confidence that Vivian had spent 4 years reading as the signature of a man who had nothing to hide and now read as something else entirely. He knocked on her open door and smiled. "Morning," he said. "How are we looking?" "Come in," she said. "Close the door." Something moved behind his eyes. A small recalibration rapid and controlled the kind that happened when a person who was very good at reading rooms detected a frequency they had not expected. He closed the door and sat down across from her in the same chair where Ethan Cole had sat the afternoon before, which Vivian noted with an irony that she kept entirely off her face. "I want to talk about the site visit report," she said. "Of course." Unhesitating. "What do you need to know?" "The quality control section," she said. "Page 31 of your report notes, QC records reviewed satisfactory. I want to understand what you specifically examined." "Standard review," he said. "We went through their testing documentation, their internal performance logs, their quality certification records. Everything was consistent with what they'd represented." "Which testing documentation?" A pause. The pause was not long. It was the pause of a man deciding between two versions of a sentence. "The current cycle reports," he said, "the 2023 performance data. Not the third quarter board minutes from 2021. The pause this time was different in quality from the first one. It was not a deciding pause. It was an arriving pause. The pause of a man who had just understood that the room he was sitting in was not the room he had walked into. "That would be unusual to request," he said carefully. "Board minutes aren't standard due diligence material. They are when the performance data in the public filings doesn't match the test results reported to the board in those minutes," Vivian said. Her voice was completely level. "Which someone with your experience would have known to check." Daniel looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, the expression on his face was not a performance of something. It was just a face stripped of the layer of practiced ease that had been its constant covering. And underneath that layer was a man who was doing rapid calculations and finding that none of them were arriving at a number he could use. "Vivian," he started. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, with the quiet finality of someone closing a door. "I want you to understand what has happened. Last night, Crowe Industries submitted a formal fraud disclosure to the SEC field office, including the complete Meridian due diligence file, an independent analysis of the performance data discrepancies, and security footage from our parking garage at 9:05 last night." The color left his face in a way that was not dramatic but was absolute. "The man you spoke with is Richard Holt, Meridian board member," Vivian continued. "The SEC is already aware of his involvement. What happens next is no longer in my hands or yours." Daniel said nothing. He was very still in the way that people were still when every possible movement led somewhere worse. "I have one question for you," Vivian said, "and I want you to understand that your answer does not change what has already been filed. It changes nothing legally. I'm asking it for myself." He looked at her. "How long?" she said. The question was simple. It was not asking about the mechanics of the fraud, or the structure of the arrangement with Holt, or the financial terms of whatever had been promised. It was asking the thing that the documents could not answer. How long had the man she had trusted to help her build something real been working to redirect that building towards someone else's purposes? Daniel looked at the window. The city was doing its morning work outside, vast and indifferent, moving at the speed of its own hunger. 2 years, he said. Vivian absorbed that. 2 years. Long enough that the things he had helped her build during that time had to be reviewed for what else might be inside them. Long enough that trust, once a structural element of how this company functioned, had to be understood as something that had been load-bearing in a building that had also been quietly undermined. "You should go," she said. "Security will escort you out, and your personal items will be delivered to you. Do not contact anyone in this company." He stood up. He did not say anything else because there was nothing left to say that was not already in the hands of people whose job it was to hear it in a formal setting with a transcript being made. He walked out. The door closed behind him with a sound that was entirely ordinary, the small mechanical click of a latch engaging, carrying no weight at all except the weight of what it closed on. Vivian sat at her desk for a moment in the quiet of a room from which something had just been removed. And she breathed, and she thought about the morning before, about a man with a mop bucket backing through a service door into a room full of people who did not see him. She picked up her phone and called a number she had added to her contacts the previous evening after he had left the building with his daughter and his dinosaur backpack and his 14 months of grief and his mind that saw patterns where other people saw data. It rang 4 times. She had expected voicemail. "Hello?" His voice was thick with the specific texture of someone woken from a sleep they needed more of. "It's Vivian Crowe," she said. A pause. The sound of adjustment of someone moving from horizontal to vertical, of a man recalibrating to a morning that had started earlier than expected. "Is something wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "Something is finished, and something else is beginning. And I need to ask you something before the day starts, and I lose the moment." "Okay," he said carefully. "I want to offer you a job," she said. "A real one, not a temp assignment. A permanent position with a title and a salary that reflects what you're actually worth. Which, based on yesterday, I have concluded is considerably more than what the market valued you at before it broke, and considerably more than $16.50 an hour." The silence on his end was not the silence of surprise exactly. It was the silence of a man who had prepared himself for a certain kind of world, a world where what had happened yesterday was a single anomalous event that he would carry quietly and return to his regular life after, and who was now receiving information that the world was being rearranged without his advance consent. "What position?" he said. "Director of Risk Analysis," she said. "You would build the department, your methodology, your team, your process. The job is specifically to find the things that our standard due diligence is not designed to look for. The structural vulnerabilities that look like assets until you apply stress to them." She paused. "Your words from yesterday. I wrote them down." Another silence. Longer this time. "The salary," he said. She told him a number. The silence that followed that number had a different quality from all the silences before it. It was the silence of a man hearing something that was going to require him to rebuild a significant portion of the architecture of his daily life, the careful, painful architecture of a person who had learned to make very little go a very long way, and who was now being told that the engineering assumptions had changed. "Mia's school," he said. "PS 187. She's happy there." "The position is based in this building," Vivian said. "Nothing requires you to move. I would need to give notice to the temp agency. I'll handle the temp agency. I have 2 other shifts this week. I'll handle those too." A long pause. Why? He said. Not suspiciously, genuinely. The question of a man who had learned to look for the variance between what was presented and what was real, and who was applying that skill now to the most important offer he had received in 3 years. Vivian looked at the window at the city that was beginning to fill with morning light, at the skyline that she had spent 20 years building herself into a permanent part of. Because yesterday you walked into a room full of the most expensive professional expertise money could assemble, she said, and you saw something that none of them saw. And the reason you saw it is not luck, and it's not accident. It's because of who you are. And I have spent 20 years building things with the right materials, and I know the right material when I find it. A pause. Also because I spent 6 hours last night thinking about all the floors of all the buildings where people like you are pushing cleaning carts past rooms full of people who will never know what they're walking past. And I can't fix all of those situations, but I can fix this one. The quiet on the other end of the line was the quiet of something settling into place. Okay, Ethan Cole said. One word. Exactly enough. Be here at 9, Vivian said. Use the main entrance. She hung up and looked at the door through which Daniel Mercer had walked out of her company 30 minutes ago. And then she looked at the chair where Ethan Cole had sat the day before, and she thought about the specific nature of exchange, what left and what arrived, what the world removed and what it sent through a service door when you were not paying attention. Then she opened her laptop and began the work of building something new on the ground that the morning had cleared. He wore the same clothes he had worn the day before because they were the best clothes he owned. Dark slacks and a collared shirt that he had kept pressed out of a habit that had survived everything else falling apart around it. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 7:45 while Mia ate cereal at the kitchen table and talked about a dream she had involving a horse that could solve math problems. And he looked at himself the way a person looked at themselves before something they did not have a word for yet. He did not look like a director of anything. He looked like a man who had been carrying too much for too long and whose face had recorded every month of it with the faithful accuracy of a ledger that did not allow for corrections, only new entries. But underneath that, underneath the shadows and the leanness and the 3 weeks of hair that still needed a cut, there was something that had not been visible in the mirror for a long time. The something that Vivian had heard in his voice when he said, okay. The something that Mia had identified with the uncomplicated precision of a 7-year-old when she said the sad went away. He was not sure it had gone away entirely. He was not sure it ever would completely. But it had moved. It had shifted from the foreground to somewhere he could carry without it blocking his view of what was in front of him. "Daddy, are you nervous?" Mia asked from the kitchen. He looked at her around the bathroom door. She was watching him with the frank attention of someone who had developed through necessity and observation an accurate ability to read him. "A little," he said. "Mom used to say nervous meant something mattered," she said, returning to her cereal with the ease of someone who had delivered the relevant information and considered the subject handled. He looked at himself in the mirror for another moment. "She was right," he said. He dropped Mia at school at 8:15, which gave him 40 minutes to walk the 12 blocks to Crow Tower rather than taking the subway. He needed the time and the cold October air and the specific quality of being in motion through a city that did not know or care about what was happening to him, which was the same quality that had made the city bearable during the worst months and was now in a different register, making this morning bearable too. He walked past the building twice before he went in. Not from hesitation, but from something closer to ceremony, the specific need to mark the before and the after of a threshold, rather than passing through it without acknowledgement. The first time he had entered this building, he had come through the service entrance on the north side, signed in with a temp agency badge, and taken the freight elevator to the maintenance floor. The main entrance, with its revolving glass doors and its lobby that was the size of a small concert hall, and its security desk staffed by people who looked at you according to how you were dressed, when you came through the door, had not been part of his geography. He went through the revolving door. The security guard at the main desk looked up at him with the professionally neutral expression of someone waiting to categorize an arrival. "Ethan Cole," he said. "I have a 9 o'clock with Vivian Crowe." The guard checked something on his screen and his expression shifted in the small but visible way that expression shifted when a name resolved into something that changed the category. "Of course, Mr. Cole," he said. "Ms. Crowe's assistant has you cleared. Elevators are to your right, 42nd floor." The 42nd floor, not 27 where the boardroom was, not 26 where the filing room was. The 42nd floor, which was the executive floor, which was where Vivian Crowe's office was, which was the floor she arrived at 13 minutes before everyone else every morning to preserve a gap that meant something. He rode the elevator alone, and the city fell away beneath him through the glass. And he thought about the morning 2 days ago when he had ridden the freight elevator to the maintenance floor and signed out a mop bucket and been given a work order for a spill on the 27th floor that had turned out not to exist. The doors opened on 42. Sandra Vivian's assistant was at her desk and looked up with a warmth that was genuine rather than performed, which told him something about the kind of office this was when the boardroom was not in session and the performances were not required. "Mr. Cole," she said, "she's expecting you. Go right in." The office was large in the way that offices belonging to people who had earned them were large, not ostentatiously, but functionally, with space enough to think and move and hold a conversation without the geometry of the room pressing in, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a desk that was not the obsidian statement piece of the boardroom, but a working surface covered in the organized density of someone who processed large volumes of information and had developed systems for managing it. Bookshelves with actual books, not decorative volumes arranged by the spine color, but books that had been read with tabs and the slightly irregular edges of pages that had been turned in real time. Vivian was standing at the window when he came in. She turned around and looked at him in the direct, unhurried way she looked at everything, and for a moment neither of them said anything because the moment did not require it yet. "You found the main entrance," she said. "Only took me 2 passes," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "Sit down, Ethan." He sat. She sat across from him, not at the desk, but in the pair of chairs arranged near the window, which was a different configuration than a desk conversation, and carried a different set of implications. The implication of a conversation between 2 people rather than an executive and an applicant. "Before we talk about the position," she said, "I want to tell you where things stand this morning." "All right." "The SEC contact reviewed the submission last night. He called me at 6:40 this morning." She paused. "He is opening a formal inquiry into Meridian Defense Systems, specifically their performance data representations to investors and potential acquirers over the past 3 years. Richard Holt has already been contacted, and his legal team has responded. Which, in the experience of people who do this work, suggests he expected it and had counsel prepared." "Which means there was infrastructure," Ethan said. "This wasn't improvised." "No," Vivian said. "It was not improvised. The preliminary assessment is that it was a deliberate and coordinated effort to inflate Meridian's acquisition value before their primary military contracts came up for renewal and the performance gap became unavoidable. The theory is that they needed to transfer the liability to an acquiring company before it surfaced." A pause. "The acquiring company they had in mind was us." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And Daniel." "Daniel Mercer retained counsel last night. He has not spoken publicly. The SEC will determine the scope of his involvement as the inquiry proceeds." She looked at him. "He will not be returning to this building." "How are you?" Ethan asked. The question surprised her. He could see it in the brief pause before she responded, the small recalibration of a person who was not often asked that question in a professional context by people who meant it literally. "I've been building this company for 20 years, she said. "I've made decisions that were wrong and I've recovered from them. I've trusted people who did not deserve it and I've learned from that. But this," she looked at the window. 2 years. He was inside this company, inside the decisions that shaped it for 2 years, working against everything we were building. That is not something I process quickly." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't. But I've learned that the way forward from something like this is not to stop building. It's to build better." She looked back at him. "Which is why you're here." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory that Ethan had not expected to cover in a first meeting. Not just the formal structure of the position she was offering, but the philosophy of it, what the risk analysis function had been at Crowe Industries, what it had failed to do, and what she wanted it to become. She was not describing a role. She was describing a problem and asking him to design the solution, which was a different kind of conversation entirely, and one that engaged a part of him that had been quiet for 3 years and was now, with some caution and some wonder, beginning to speak again. He asked questions. She answered them directly without the softening that people sometimes used when the answers were difficult, which he appreciated because the softened version of a difficult answer was, in his experience, just a version with the load-bearing information removed. He told her what he needed to build the function she was describing. The access to pre-acquisition documentation at the earliest stage of deal consideration, not after months of parallel work, had already created institutional momentum toward completion. A team of 3 initially with specific expertise across the sectors where the company was most active. Direct reporting access to her not filtered through an intermediary because the value of the function was precisely in its independence from the pressures that moved every other department toward confirming what the deal teams wanted to hear. She agreed to all of it without negotiation, which told him she had already thought through it and arrived at the same place independently and was waiting to see if he would arrive there too. At 11, Marcus Webb knocked and came in, and the expression on his face when he saw Ethan had changed from the controlled alarm of 2 days ago into something warmer and more direct.
"Good to see you," Marcus said, and shook Ethan's hand with the sincerity of a man who meant it specifically and not generically. "I want you to know I've been doing this for 28 years, and I have never in my professional life been more grateful that someone interrupted a meeting I was in." "I was supposed to be cleaning a spill," Ethan said. "Best spill that never happened," Marcus said. There was something almost like laughter in the room, then the tentative, genuine variety that emerged in the aftermath of something serious when the serious part had been handled and the people involved were still in the process of understanding that they had come through it. Over the following 3 weeks, Ethan Cole became a different kind of invisible. Not the invisibility of the maintenance uniform, the kind that happened when the structures of a place categorized you as infrastructure and stopped seeing you as a person.
This was the invisibility of someone who worked in the background of things by design, who moved through the information architecture of a company without announcing himself, who read documents the way other people read landscapes, looking not at what was there, but at the shape of what was missing. He hired 2 analysts in the first week, both of them recommendations from former colleagues at Harman Capital who had survived the restructuring and gone on to other firms, and who, when Ethan called them, answered with the specific enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for someone to call and ask them to do the thing they were actually best at. The first acquisition target he reviewed under the new structure was a mid-sized logistics technology company in Atlanta that the deal team had been building toward for 4 months. The materials were clean. The due diligence was thorough. There were no discrepancies between the reported performance data and the internal documentation. He told Vivian it was a good deal. She signed the authorization and the deal closed in 6 weeks, and the integration went exactly as projected, and that was in its own way as important as finding the fraud in the Meridian file, because the function he was building was not just a fraud detection apparatus. It was a truth apparatus, and truth ran in both directions. It found what was wrong, and it confirmed what was right, and both of those things had value. The Meridian inquiry moved forward through the autumn with the methodical pace of a regulatory process that understood it was building something that needed to hold under scrutiny. 3 additional executives at Meridian were identified as having knowledge of the performance data gap. Richard Holt's legal team, after 2 weeks of aggressive posturing, shifted to a cooperation posture that suggested the government's case was considerably stronger than Holt had initially hoped. Daniel Mercer's cooperation came later and was more complicated. His attorney spent 6 weeks arguing that his role had been limited, that his relationship with Holt had been improperly characterized, that the single covering sentence in the site visit report reflected a judgment call about materiality, rather than a deliberate concealment. The government's response to each of these arguments was, in the understated language of federal filings, comprehensive. Ethan did not follow the case closely. He knew what he had found in the documents, and he had delivered that to the people whose job it was to act on it, and the process of justice, with its slowness and its complexity, and its occasional capacity to arrive at outcomes that felt insufficient to the harm done, was a different system from the one he operated in. He could not control it. He could control the quality of what he found and the integrity of how he delivered it, and those were the things he focused on. What he focused on most in the quiet hours after Mia was asleep and the apartment was still was the architecture of what he was building. Not just the professional structure, the team, and the process, and the methodology, but the other architecture, the one that a life was made of. The way the mornings had changed, the way the specific dread that had lived in the first 5 minutes of every day, the immediate arithmetical inventory of what was owed and what was threatened and how far the gap between them had grown overnight, had been replaced by something that was not its opposite, but was at least not its twin. He called the dentist he had been avoiding for 8 months and made an appointment. He bought Mia the winter coat she had needed since September, the one with the hood that actually stayed up, which she had been requesting with escalating specificity since the first cold week. He paid 3 months of overdue medical bills in a single sitting, which felt less like relief and more like the closing of a parenthesis on a sentence that had been open too long. He did not tell Mia all of it. She was 7, and the information she needed was not the financial detail, but the texture of the daily life around her, and that texture was changing in ways she could feel without needing to name. She had started sleeping later in the mornings, which her teacher mentioned to Ethan at pickup one day, noting that children sometimes slept better when they felt the adults around them were less anxious. Her drawings, which she produced in the volume of a small industrial operation, had shifted in color palette, less of the heavy dark greens and grays that had characterized the winter months, more yellows and oranges and a specific electric blue that she used for anything she considered exciting. He kept them all. 6 weeks after he started, Vivian asked him to come to a board meeting, not to present, not formally. She wanted him in the room while the new executive team was briefed on the changes to the risk analysis function because she wanted the board to understand the context for those changes, and the context was not a policy revision or a structural reorganization. The context was a man who had walked in from a service door. He sat at the obsidian table for the first time without a mop bucket. The board members looked at him with the various expressions of people who had heard a story and were now meeting the person the story was about, which was an unusual experience and one he navigated by being exactly what he was. Direct, unperformative, precise about what he had found and how he had found it, and clear about the limitations of what any system, however well-designed, could guarantee. Preston Michaels, the board's eldest member, a man of 71 who had been in and out of corporate boardrooms for 40 years, and who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being impressed by most of it, leaned forward when Ethan finished and said, "What made you say something that morning? You could have left." Ethan considered the question. "She asked me what I would do," he said, "with that kind of money on the line. And I knew the answer. It seemed dishonest not to give it." Preston looked at him for a long moment. "That's a rarer quality than you might think," he said. "I know," Ethan said. After the meeting, Vivian walked with him back down the corridor toward his office, which was on the 38th floor and had a window that looked north and which he had furnished with the specific minimalism of someone who wanted the space to function rather than to declare anything. "How are you feeling about the position?" she asked. "I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing," he said, "which is something I haven't felt in a long time." "Good." She paused at the elevator. "I want to talk to you about something else." The board raised the question of formalizing the partnership structure of the risk function, making it a standing committee with direct board access rather than a departmental function. It would change your title and your reporting structure. "To what title, Chubb?" "Chief Risk Officer," she said, "with a seat at the executive table." He looked at her. "That's a significant change." "Yes." "You'd be giving a man who was pushing a mop cart 8 weeks ago a seat at your executive table." "I'd be giving the man who saved this company from a $3.2 billion fraud a seat at my executive table," she said. "The mop cart is contextual detail." He was quiet for a moment. "There's one more thing," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I want to say it before I talk myself into framing it differently." She looked at him with the direct, undefended attention of someone who had decided to stop managing the distance between what they thought and what they said. "This company has your work inside it now. The function you are building is going to be part of how it operates for as long as it operates.
I want that to be reflected in something permanent, not just a title. What are you proposing? She told him. He was quiet for a longer moment than any of the previous quiet moments, and in that silence, Vivian watched his face go through something that was not a performance of emotion, but the actual thing, the unmanaged version that people showed when they had stopped preparing their responses and were simply receiving what was happening to them. You don't have to do that, he said finally. I know, she said. That's why I'm doing it. He looked at the elevator doors, looked at the floor, looked at her. Okay, he said. The same word he had said on the phone 6 weeks ago. Still exactly enough. 3 months after the morning that had started with a mop bucket and ended with a federal inquiry on a cold January day when the city was doing what January cities did, which was to strip everything back to its structural bones and show you what was actually holding things up. Ethan Cole stood on the sidewalk outside Crowe Tower and looked up at what was being installed on the building's facade. The letters were 10 feet tall, brushed steel, catching the winter light in a way that made them look like they had been there forever, which was the quality that good permanent things had. Mia stood beside him, with her coat hood up, the hood that actually stayed up, and she looked at the letters with the wide-eyed attention of someone receiving important information. Vivian stood on his other side. The last letter settled into place, and the workers secured it and stepped back, and the three of them looked at it together in the particular silence of people who are standing in front of something that was not there yesterday and will be there long after today. Crowe Coal and Coal Industries. That's your name, Mia said. She was not asking. It is, Ethan said. And that's your name too, Mia said to Vivian. It is, Vivian said. Mia considered this with the gravity she brought to important things. So you built it together. Neither of them answered immediately because the answer was more layered than a 7-year-old needed it to be, and also because the simple version of the answer was true and was sufficient. Yes, Ethan said. We did. Mia looked at the sign for another moment, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The dinosaur backpack that had traveled through the worst year of their lives, riding on her shoulders with the cheerful resilience of a thing that did not know what it had witnessed. Mom would have liked that, she said. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would add to it. Vivian looked at the sign and thought about the afternoon 2 days before Christmas when she had called her lawyer and told him to begin the process of formally restructuring the company name, and about the way he had paused for a long moment before asking with the careful language of someone who served powerful clients and was accustomed to navigating their intentions whether she had considered the optics of the decision. She had told him she had considered them thoroughly and found them excellent. The board had approved the change unanimously, which was how board votes went when Vivian Crowe had already decided something, and the directors had enough experience to recognize the difference between a vote and a formality. Preston Michaels had called her afterward just to say one thing. Good instincts, he had said. She had thanked him and ended the call because she did not need the validation, but she had held the words for a moment before putting them down, the way you held something warm before you set it aside. They stood there for a while longer, the three of them, the city moving around them, in the vast, indifferent way that cities moved carrying its millions of separate stories, without acknowledging any of them specifically. Then Vivian's phone rang, which it always did, and Ethan's phone buzzed, which it always did, and Mia announced that she was hungry, which she always did, and the particular stillness of the moment released itself gently back into the ordinary sequence of a day that had things in it that needed to be done. Dinner, Ethan said to Mia. Pizza, she said immediately, and without ambiguity. Pizza, he agreed. Vivian looked at him over the top of Mia's head and said, Go. The building will still be here tomorrow. I know, he said. He took Mia's hand and they walked down the sidewalk together, the city receiving them the way it received everyone without ceremony, without recognition, one story among millions. But the sign behind them caught the last of the winter light and held it for a moment before the afternoon shifted 2 names in steel level and permanent, reflecting the city back at itself. It had started with a humiliation in a boardroom.
A janitor with a mop, a CEO with a point to prove an audience of 12 people watching what they thought was a small and ordinary cruelty. It had ended with 2 names on a building and a little girl with a dinosaur backpack eating pizza on a Tuesday evening in January, talking about a horse that could solve math problems watched by a father who was no longer counting the cost of the meal. Which was not the ending that anyone in that boardroom had predicted, least of all the 2 people it happened to. But the numbers, as Ethan Cole had always known, told the truth if you knew how to read them. And the truth, it turned out, had never been in the deal. It had been in the man who walked in from the wrong door at the right moment and refused to look away from what he saw.